Good morning, Liberty. It is Monday morning, July 15th, 2019. My name is Michael Bolden, broadcasting to you live from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We broadcast live through our channels over at YouTube, Periscope, DLive, Twitch, and Facebook, and we have our archives, including podcast editions of iTunes, Spotify, and others, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Good Morning Liberty. I hope you guys had an awesome weekend. I had a really good one. Got to hang out with my friend Chris Ann Hall and her husband and son and for a little bit yesterday. Saw some friends and family. And it was a great weekend. I hope you had a really good one as well. And just back to work, ready to take on the statist pigs for the week. And I'm glad you're here joining me as well. Now, in this episode, we're talking about the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. This, in my opinion, is probably the most... I guess it's the most difficult one to explain and probably the most confused one for most people. It is a very difficult constitutional phrase. I mean, at least on the surface. But we're going to get into what it is, what it means, what its intention was. I'm going to go over the clause itself. I'm going to explain some of the concepts behind it, like recital, incidental powers, and something known as public trust. And then I'm going to give you guys an example of how it plays out if it were being looked at properly. Give an example, a good analogy. Well, maybe a good analogy. And then I'm also going to share with you James Madison's two-step. He had a two-step process for determining if something is necessary and proper. And I don't know if it necessarily is an exact fit for everything, but it's a really good starting point for comparing a federal act with the necessary and proper clause according to the so-called father of the Constitution. Now, before getting to that, I do want to say hi to everyone out in the live chat, everyone who is here, either whether you're leaving comments or you're just lurking in the background. Again, I'm very grateful for you spending part of your Monday with me today. Hi to Eric Nance, Thomas Putin, Don Hakes, Kenneth, Dan Reed. Good to see you as well. Over on YouTube, Tim Martin, Joe Wolverton, Teacher of Liberty. Joe is awesome. We just ran an article of his on Patrick Henry that you should definitely check out over on the 10th Amendment Center homepage. EHP training. Yes, I got to see Chris Ann. It was like an hour, but she's on her way from one city to the next, and she messaged me and says, "Hey, you want to meet up for some food if you don't have time to go to the event?" I did not have time to go to the event, but yeah, it's really great to see her and JC and Colton. They're really an awesome group of people. Anna Reyes, really good to see you as well, and Heather Rossi, Justin Bayola, David Smith, everybody, Mark, Sean. I know I'm missing some people. I'm very grateful for everyone joining me, and I hope you guys find this to be an interesting topic. Last week, I covered the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and this actually ties in, and I think from time to time, I'm going to do more and more of these episodes on various clauses of the Constitution, because we're not just, here at the 10th Amendment Center, we're not just talking about how to nullify. We have a kind of a 1-2 punch. We want to teach people what the proper role of government is under the Constitution and then how to stop them when they violate it, which is basically these days constantly. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch, and this is basically the constitutional educational portion of it. This is the first time I've really done a deep dive on necessary and proper, so I apologize in advance if it gets to be a little convoluted, but I will do my best. So let's first of all look at the text of the clause itself. It's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the very end of that list of powers delegated to Congress, and it says the Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. Legal terms. A lot of people think that they can use this clause to do everything. And in fact, in this article, it points out, and this is from Rob Nadelson, he says, most federal regulations today are justified by the necessary and proper clause. If you watched my episode on commerce last week, I pointed out that there are two main ways that they justify everything being called commerce under the Commerce Clause. One is just by renaming the word commerce to mean something else, like all gainful activity. Or a more prominent one coming up in recent times is all human interaction counts as commerce. So that's one way that they do it. By just saying commerce doesn't mean commerce, trade and associated activities, but it means everything. But what's actually prevalent on the Supreme Court, for example, is to define commerce very similarly to the way it should be defined, according to what was approved by the people of the several states in the ratification conventions. They actually get the definition of the term commerce pretty consistently right on the Supreme Court. But what they do is they say, well, now we have a different life. The economy is very interdependent, and so therefore we have to then rely on the necessary and proper clause to be able to regulate this interstate commerce, and then that gives them all kinds of other powers. So they're basically doing this 1-2 punch of saying, well, we've got this clause, and even if we get this right, we're just going to attach this on there and say, well, all of this is necessary and proper to achieve whatever we want them to achieve. And this is what Rob says in this article. He says, they can be within Congress's commerce power, but then they are said to be supported by the accompanying authority to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the power to regulate commerce. So then they regulate anything and everything based on this combination of the two. But what's interesting, he says, here's the irony of the situation. Far from granting broad authority, and he puts this in quotes if you're watching and can see the text here that's highlighted. Again, all the links are in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty, primarily for those of you who may be watching on a platform where we don't include the links. Just come to our website, or if you're listening to the podcast, come to our website. We publish those anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour after the live show is done broadcasting. So broad authority was actually used in a case, I believe it was Comstock, U.S. versus Comstock, that they can have broad authority to do basically anything. But Rob goes on, he says, the truth is the necessary and proper clause grants no power at all. None. It is not a delegation of power at all. And in fact, I'll get into this in a moment, but basically some leading founders said the power delegated to the federal government would be the same if we include a necessary and proper clause at the end of every clause, or if we had no necessary and proper clause. So the proper reading of necessary and proper is that it added no additional power to what was already delegated. Rob goes on and he says, it is placed at the end of Article 1, Section 8 as an explanation. So it's explaining the 17 powers that were delegated before that. It is called a recital. Now it's not like going to see your kids at choir. A recital was a legal term. It's still known as a legal term in some circles. It's a passage in a legal document that has no substantive legal effect, but serves to inform the reader of assumptions or facts behind the document. Another example of a recital, he writes, in the Constitution is the preamble. It doesn't delegate any new power. It is basically an explanation. Now, some people want to see the 10th Amendment as a recital. It's actually a rule of construction, and that is something if I'm going to keep doing these constitutional clauses, you guys can let me know. Email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com if you want to see more of these. When I cover the 10th, maybe that should have been the first one, but when I get to that one eventually, I'll explain what a rule of construction is. Same with the 9th Amendment as well. So a recital, it's just meant to explain what we're talking about. Now, necessary and proper is actually broken up into two parts. There's the necessary part and the proper part. So necessary assures, and I'm reading again from i2i.org, the necessary part assured the reader that the listed powers of Congress included others that were incidental. And I'm going to explain the doctrine of incidental powers shortly. It is not implied powers. An incidental power had to be less worthy or less important than the principal power, and either customarily or reasonably necessary to its exercise. Okay, that might be a bunch of mumbo-jumbo to you, but here's kind of an example of it. When exercising a necessary power, Congress should not assume control of all manufacturing on the ground that it was incidental to its power over interstate commerce. So you may say that You can't take over a whole new industry just because it's incidental. It has to be a lesser power. And then the proper part, and I'm going to get into a little bit more detail on what constitutes necessary and this incidental power. Plus the proper part, this is part 2 of necessary and proper. This incorporated the founding era understanding that government was a public trust and that laws must be in keeping with that trust. So we have 2 parts. We're talking about necessary to accomplish the delegated powers, and then proper, which informs us of this founding era understanding that government officials were acting in a fiduciary responsibility or under a public trust. Let's get in a little bit more on this incidental powers. So it explains things. It helps to explain the meaning. This is the recital part, the meaning and prevent useless arguments. It clarifies that unlike the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution should be read in light of the doctrine of incidental powers. So there was a lot of debate over including the term expressly in the 10th Amendment. And part of the reason ties into this. And if you list out that they can build post offices, for example, but you say that all you can do is the exact words in the Constitution, it does not list that they can buy land to build the post office on or hire labor to run the post office. But we understand that if you're establishing a post office, and whether you like having government post offices or not is probably a different debate. We could probably look at Spooner on that at some point. That's a hat tip to my buddy Dan Reed. If you're going to run a post office, you're going to establish post offices. You have to have power to be able to do other things that are incidental to doing this. But that doesn't mean that you run a monopoly over all package carrying. That would be a power that is greater than establishing post offices, eliminating all the competition, for example. And Rob gets into that a little bit in this article. He says, here's a simple example of how the doctrine of incidental powers works. The Constitution grants authority to establish post offices and post roads. Does to establish a road include the power to build it? One might construe establish as narrowly as reasonably possible and thereby exclude the road building. So therefore, what you end up having is something, and Jefferson talked about this on both ends of the spectrum. This article points out that Jefferson kind of looked at putting it in a total narrow way like this, where, okay, you can only establish the post office, but if no one comes in to build the road, then you're not going to have any. And he goes on a little bit later to say, like, look, it can't be so narrowly defined that the power becomes nugatory. It can't be used at all. And hopefully that makes sense. So my buddy Tom Woods did an article on this a few years ago that we republished. It's from September 2011 that cites some main points covering this idea of incidental powers. He cites George Nicholas he was a future Attorney General of Kentucky. He told the Virginia Ratifying Convention that Congress, including the necessary and proper clause, only enables them to carry into execution the powers given to them, but no additional power. This is to reinforce the fact that the necessary and proper clause was not a grant of additional power. It is a clarification, a recital to understand what can be done under those powers. In Federalist 33, Hamilton noted that the clause only made explicit what was logically and unavoidably implied in the Constitution's very nature, and that it added nothing other than simple clarification. Quote, it may be affirmed with perfect confidence that the constitutional operation of the intended government would be precisely the same if these clauses, he's talking about necessary and proper and supremacy, were entirely obliterated, as if they were repeated in every article. And Jefferson, as I was mentioning, he said, they can't be just merely convenient powers. They have to actually mean necessary, as in if delegated power is power A, if power A doesn't exist without doing 1.1, 2, and 3, then this is necessary to carry into execution the delegated powers. And he wrote it this way. The Constitution allows only the means which are necessary, not those which are merely convenient for effectuating the enumerated powers. And he goes on. He says, it was that the Constitution restrained them to the necessary means, that is to say, to those means without which the grant of power would be nugatory. And I think that's a really important distinction. So again, going back to building post offices and post roads, if you don't have the power to buy the wood, to build a building, to hire the labor, to deliver the mail, it doesn't actually say in the Constitution, the delegated power to Congress shall be to ensure that they can hire employees to run the post office. If you just limit it to the words of the text, the federal government then does nothing. I know I have a lot of friends who would be very happy with that. That is not what the Constitution says, though. So these incidental powers are lesser powers that are generally assumed to be required to carry out the delegated power. Now, there is some wiggle room there, and I think that is what becomes problematic. And a lot of people have taken it to mean that there are implied powers, which are different than incidental. Incidental are smaller powers. And this comes from a legal doctrine of principles and incidents that the founders, who were well-versed in legal theory, all understood. So when it came out of the Philadelphia Convention, the idea of principles and incidents, this was not something that they were confused by. They knew that incidents were smaller powers than the larger power, than the delegated power. Now, some opponents, some anti-federalists were concerned, I think, because they recognized that the average person may not understand that legal doctrine, and then it is going to be up to politicians to hold themselves in check in some times, or relying on politicians to hold themselves in check means they're going to twist it. Artful rulers will use artful designs, we were told in the New York Ratifying Convention, to twist the meanings of what should be logical and plain in front of our face, because the general public may not be aware of what it's supposed to mean. So it is a tricky legal phrase that can be problematic for that reason. But Jefferson was very clear on this as well. So mentioning quickly, I want to get into the public trust. This is part 2. So that's part 1. That's the principle of necessary or incidental powers. And part 2 is public trust. And the public trust doctrine says that governments, and I'm reading this, again, this link will be in the show notes, that government's agents are trustees or fiduciaries and are bound by the same duties that apply to private sector managers such as bankers, trustees, and guardians. Those duties include obligations of good faith, reasonableness, loyalty, and impartiality. In other words, being honest, avoidance of conflict of interest, serving your beneficiaries fairly, things that almost no politician in modern times has ever done. They're rarely honest, they rarely avoid conflicts of interest, and they're rarely fair and apply things outside. I mean, they generally just apply things to achieve their own political goals. An example of how this all kind of plays out comes from an article from Mike Meharry that he wrote a few years ago as well. He says, put this into practice in regards to running a grocery store. If we're talking about fiduciary duty, how you would run a business, even though government isn't a business, but you have the same level of expectations, which should be much higher than for politicians, because politicians seem to just do what they want as long as a poll tells them that it's okay. So there are 3 parts. First of all, it has to be necessary. If you have a manager that you hire to run your grocery store or your little market, you say, look, run this grocery store, be awesome with it, make it profitable, do the duties that you're supposed to do to be a grocery store manager without having to list every single thing that they may or may not do and micromanage them. No one likes a micromanager on the job, right? Could you imagine what that would take? And so he goes through 3 different pieces. He says, first of all, it has to be necessary to carry out the original purpose. So if you're managing a grocery store, you're running the store for an owner, a group of owners. For example, you would then have the power to purchase corn from a farmer to sell in the grocery store. It doesn't say in your contract, okay, well, you can purchase corn, you can purchase raspberries, you can purchase dates. I mean, what happens when they get offered a discounted product? My local market here in Little Tokyo, the market, what's in stock, changes all the time. And this even includes packaged goods, because they'll get offered from some distributor, you should try this product, we'll give it to you at a discount, and then they put it in there on some really ridiculous sale price, and if a bunch of people buy it, maybe they'll carry it regularly. Sometimes they don't. Now, if the owners and the manager are different in that store, would the owner have to list out every single product that they might be able to make a purchase of? No, it's understood that the general managerial duties mean that they can go and purchase the corn. Now, it has to be customary, normal in operating the business. And Mike writes it this way. He says, the guy running my grocery store couldn't get rid of all the food and sell porno. Okay, that's an odd example. I should have pre-read this, Meharry. I guess basically he wanted to come up with the most extreme example of something that has nothing to do with groceries, because that would clearly not constitute a customary way of running a grocery store. Wow, we've got to be not safe for work here, Mike. I guess we'll have a little chat on that tomorrow. And then he also says, an incidental power can never rise to a level greater than the original power delegated. So again, we're talking about principles, the principal power, which is managing the grocery store, and incidental powers to run the store. For example, buying corn, bringing in sale products, maybe changing pricing, things like that. And he says, my grocery store manager would have the authority to pay a mechanic for fixing a broken freezer, even if that's not listed out in the contract to run the grocery store. But he wouldn't have the power to sell the building and invest the money in the stock market for me. That's something that's totally different. It's greater than the original power delegated. And this is understood under both the principles and incidents doctrine and the doctrine of public trust. Now, James Madison had this two-step process. Basically, anytime the feds try doing something, you're supposed to ask two questions. And Mike Meharry writes out about this as well. The two-step process. First, he says, and this is in Madison's words, not mine, not Mike's, not anybody else's. He says, first, whenever, therefore, a question arises concerning the constitutionality of a particular power, the first question is whether the power be expressed in the Constitution. If it be, the question is decided. In other words, if it is expressly listed in the Constitution, then you know it's necessary and proper. There aren't many. Some people will tell you there's 17 powers. Some people will tell you 18. Some people like me will tell you there's somewhere between 30 and 35 because there are powers delegated in Article 1, Section 8. If we include necessary and proper, that's 18. There are some other lesser powers delegated throughout the rest of the document. If you count them all up, depending on how you count them, let's say 30 powers. So most of the time when they do something, you're not going to find it specifically listed word for word in the text of the document itself. So that's question one. Now, if it's not listed out, then you have to go to question two. He says, if the power be not expressed, the next inquiry must be whether it is properly an incident to an express power and necessary to its execution. If it be, it may be exercised by Congress. If it be not, Congress cannot exercise it. And I think the same way. As soon as I read this, I'm like, okay, everyone's going to have a reason why it's necessary to carry it out. But I think it becomes a little bit more clear. Clearly, there's still some gray area here on what counts as incidental. So there is that's partly what makes things very difficult. And of course, it is up to people to hold politicians in check, not necessarily by voting them out, because, of course, you want to get rid of all the bad ones, which constitutes basically all of them all the time. But if you're relying on new politicians to get in there and say, oh, all this, quote, necessary power that is laying here on the plate in front of me, I won't use that. Of course, this ties into the big step of how do you deal with it. First of all, people need to be educated on what this all means. And I'm only giving some very basic examples here in a 30-minute podcast of what an incidental power is. But the bottom line is it has to be something that's smaller than the original power. And I think the power to establish post offices and post roads is a good starting point. Just taking a peek over in the live chat here. to see what's going on. We'll find out if people are telling me I'm doing an awful job on this or doing a good job. Thomas Putin asks, did anyone out there ever read the book, The Founding Fathers Guide to the Constitution? Absolutely. I probably have it's not handy. I have a copy of it right here. My cat food. I always love your citations. I've educated myself tremendously through them. Thank you. Hi to Ward Lawrence, who joined here late, but glad to see you. Joe Wolverton says Google Sentinel number 5. I don't know that one off the top of my head. If you can post a link to that, Joe, in the notes or in the live chat, that way people can see it as well. And let's see what else we have here. My cat food. All that I know is our federal government is far too large and powerful, and we need to begin culling it like as of yesterday. Yeah, no doubt about it. Brock Story wants to know what's up with the 14th Amendment. I guess that would be another good piece of the Constitution to cover as well. People are talking about term limits. So a lot of interesting requests and some back and forth. But hopefully this has been at least educational and interesting. I hope you guys are learning something. I learn as I go through this, as I talk it through with you guys as well. Again, necessary and proper breaks down into two main parts. The necessary part, which is based on the doctrine of principles and incidents. A power to regulate commerce can't be the power to take over or end commerce. The power to promote the general welfare is not the power to fund the general welfare, for example. The power to establish post offices and post roads is not the power to have a monopoly over all package delivery. The power to establish post roads, we know post roads, for example, are roads with posts, like mile markers between them. Basically, the modern interstate highway system. The power to establish post roads is not a federal power over all roads established everywhere in the country. Those are a matter of local concern. So these are ways of sweeping up the principal power with so-called incidental or implied powers is how they do it these days. And then part 2 is this doctrine of public trust, where you're going to have a customary way of managing something and holding them to an established standard about that. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the established standards these days have been twisted and turned into a lot of centralized power, so we need to get back and push back on that at every turn possible. Again, I hope you guys are finding this interesting. It's not easy for me to explain. If you have questions, please continue to post them in the comments. Feel free to email me over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Of course, smash the like, hit subscribe, get bell notifications, share links, all that good stuff. And of course, leave some reviews over at iTunes if you listen to the podcast version. I appreciate all that support. And all of it does actually help us spread the word. Wherever you watch or listen to this show, the platforms are very easily triggered. So taking all those free actions tells the algorithm, oh, wow, we should show this program to more people. So all of those things, whether it's comments, live or in the archive, thumbs up, all that stuff, that really does help us reach more people. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your Monday is off to a good start. We'll see you again, as we always do, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. And have an awesome day. Thanks again for being here with me.